Have you ever been forced to give up something that was yours because someone in power wanted it that way? I never thought that raising a few goats would make me a target for a corrupt HOA. But when they tried to force me out of my home with illegal laws, I knew I had to take a stand. This isn't just about goats. It's about defending freedom and fighting against abuse of power. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Now let's dive in. Standing on the land my family has held for half a century, I never thought I would be at risk of losing everything over a few goats. This land was my father's and my grandfather's legacy, the land I grew up on, the land I have devoted my life to caring for and nurturing. I had been a county agricultural advisor for 30 years, helping other farmers manage their land, protect their crops, care for their livestock, and navigate complex legalities. And now I was the one being threatened by a system that was supposed to protect me. When I retired 2 years ago, I decided to downsize my father's farm, no longer raising cattle but keeping a small herd of goats, which I rescued from closed or abandoned farms. They are not only my pets, but also a part of my soul, especially after my wife passed away. Every morning their squeals pull me out of bed, giving me the motivation to go out and continue living. They are my family. The area where I live used to be a quiet suburb, where farmers and longtime residents lived in harmony. But 7 years ago, an urban project sprang up, gradually encircling this land. The new residents came with a different mindset, not understanding and not caring about rural life. 5 years ago, they established an HOA, with the initial rules only to maintain the landscape and hygiene. I did not object, because they committed that my property would be considered heritage and would not be affected. At that time, the first president, Tom Watson, even complimented my small farm on beautifying the neighborhood. Things changed when Linda Peterson took over the HOA last spring, shortly after her brother, Mark Peterson, won a seat on the city council. I began to notice Linda's suspicious looks during HOA inspections, especially when she stood on my fence, tapping away on her phone, seemingly taking notes. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I should have noticed something was amiss. 3 days after Mark took office, Linda showed up at the door, not saying hello, just holding a folder on a clipboard. Before I could invite her in, she announced that she was conducting an official inspection of the HOA, making sure I was in compliance with the city's new regulations. She emphasized the word official with great force, as if her authority were absolute. As I looked at the documents she handed me, I quickly noticed something strange. These were not the HOA's adopted bylaws, but drafts of unapproved city ordinances. The word draft was still printed clearly on each page. When I pointed this out, Linda just smiled and said that they would soon become law, as her brother was pushing them as fast as he could. Just a week later, I received an official notice from the HOA, demanding that the entire herd be removed within 30 days or face a public health penalty. They claimed that my goats posed a health and environmental hazard, despite the fact that no one had ever complained about them in 50 years. I couldn't believe my eyes. My family had lived here before this neighborhood existed, before the new houses. I had helped the community farm and manage the land, and now the newcomers saw me as an obstacle, a nuisance to be removed. But I wasn't about to back down. I knew the law, and I realized that the goats weren't the real problem. They were after the land itself. And I had to find out why before it was too late. At first, I thought the HOA was simply a group of residents who wanted to keep the neighborhood clean, but I was wrong. After receiving the letter requesting the removal of the goats, I immediately called the city office to verify. If these regulations were actually in effect, I wanted to know exactly when and on what basis they were passed. But the answer stunned me. The regulations the HOA cited did not exist in the current system. They were just proposals, not officially adopted. So why was the HOA acting as if they were in effect? I immediately drafted a response letter stating that I would not comply with a regulation that had not yet taken effect. I sent it by official mail and email, believing that would stop the HOA's efforts. But a week later, I received another letter, this time with a more assertive tone. They no longer mentioned the city code, but cited the HOA's updated regulations, which prohibited all forms of livestock. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had lived here before this neighborhood existed. My family had been here before the new homes were built. I had helped the community when they needed advice on farming and land management. And now the newcomers saw me as an obstacle to development, a nuisance to be removed. But I wasn't about to back down easily. I knew the law. I knew what they were doing was wrong. I didn't know what they were up to, but I knew that my goats weren't the real problem. This wasn't just about the innocent animals. They were after the land, and I had to find out why before it was too late. The thing was, the HOA had never placed any restrictions on me before. When I took over the farm from my father, the land was outside their jurisdiction. Now they were claiming that my exemption was no longer valid. I called Linda for an explanation, but instead of being polite, she was cold and threatening. She announced that a new law was coming and I had to comply, prepared to accept it or enter a war you can't win, and hung up. Holding the phone, I looked out into the yard where the goats were grazing peacefully, unaware that they had just become the focus of a power struggle. I quickly realized that this was not just a case of one HOA abusing its power, but an organized scheme. I researched the city council and discovered a connection between Linda and Mark Peterson, who had just been elected to the council and was in charge of urban planning. Coincidentally, shortly after Mark took office, the HOA suddenly changed its rules targeting my property. Why? I started hearing from longtime neighbors who had lived here before the HOA was formed. Some were also having trouble with the new changes Linda was imposing. Ellen Baker, who lives across the street from me, said they tried to fine her for hanging too many birdhouses in her yard. Frank Thompson, who lives next door, said the HOA asked him to remove a vegetable garden in his front yard. They weren't just after me. They were trying to remove elements that didn't fit in with the new neighborhood. I decided to dig deeper. I went to the landowner's office to look at the planning documents. What I found was chilling. A major redevelopment plan was being considered by the city council with the goal of building a new government complex right on this site. And the most telling thing? My land was right in the middle of the area they were planning to reclaim. Flipping through the council minutes, I found discussions about strategic properties that would need to be cleared for the project. They didn't name the landowners, but when I compared the proposed map to the actual boundaries, I realized that my farm was one of the most important targets. They didn't care about my goats. They wanted my land. I'd dealt with financial hardships, including the loss of my wife, but I'd never felt so attacked. When I realized that Linda and Mark were not only trying to change the neighborhood but were plotting to take my land, I knew I couldn't sit idly by. I began gathering evidence, researching legal issues, and seeking support from longtime residents, but I never expected people I once considered neighbors to turn on me so quickly. I couldn't stand by any longer. If I did nothing, the land my family had cared for generations would soon be a vacant lot waiting for some kind of government building. I needed to find out who was behind this, and more importantly, I needed to find a way to stop it before it was too late. Within a week of my response to the HOA, things began to change for the worse. Before, when I walked through the neighborhood, I would always get friendly waves and greetings from new neighbors. Now, when I showed up, they would turn away or pretend not to see me. Some would even stop in front of my fence, looking at the goat pen as if it were a blemish on their neighborhood. I started getting strange looks and whispered conversations as I walked by. Then the smear campaign began. A new Facebook page called Modernizing Lexington Estates popped up, posting a steady stream of attacks on me. Long-distance photos of my farm were accompanied by captions like, "Time to bring this neighborhood into the 21st century," and "Are we going to accept these low standards forever?" One post even called my property a slum in the middle of a modern community, even though I had always kept it clean and had never had any complaints. I wasn't much of a social media user, but Frank, a close neighbor, warned me that this wasn't a coincidence, that someone was behind it. When the social media posts weren't enough pressure, the anonymous messages started coming. First, I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox with a typewritten note inside. "The council has decided, you just haven't realized it yet." Then other messages appeared in the following days. "People like you should live in the country, not in a developing community." I didn't know who sent them, but I knew their goal was to make me feel isolated, to make me question my place in the community I'd spent my entire life in. The pressure was mounting. I couldn't sleep well at night, my mind racing with thoughts about the future of this property. If they really passed the new law, what could I do to stop it? Would I have the strength to fight an HOA with the entire city behind it? The questions kept swirling in my mind, and I began to feel exhausted. The stress reached its peak when I received a preliminary inspection notice from the city. The letter said that an inspector would be coming to evaluate the property according to the new regulations that were about to be passed. As I read the letter in the front yard, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as heavy as a rock, making it hard to breathe. I held onto the mailbox to keep my balance. My vision gradually blurred. I unconsciously reached for my phone, dialed 911, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the sound of machines monitoring my heart. A young doctor with a worried look in his eyes told me that I had just had a cardiac event. Not a full-blown heart attack, but serious enough to warn that the stress was destroying my health. He made it clear that if I didn't lower my pressure, the next one might not be just a warning. I lay there, listening to my heartbeat on the monitor, and for the first time, I wondered if it was worth fighting. Maybe it was time to admit defeat. Maybe I should sell the land, leave, start over somewhere else. My father would understand, right? He wouldn't want me to die fighting the government. But then, as I was still hesitating, the door to the hospital room opened, and the people who came in changed everything. At first I thought it was the paramedics, but when I looked up, I saw Frank Thompson, Ellen Baker, and a strange woman. Frank was carrying a bag of groceries. Ellen was holding my hand nervously, but my eyes stopped on the woman. She was a strong-looking woman, with short silver hair and the sharp eyes of a seasoned legal professional. When she placed her briefcase on the bedside table, I knew I was about to hear something important. Her name was Susan Carter, and she was no ordinary resident of the neighborhood. Susan had moved into Lexington Estates just over a month ago, into the house the Patterson family had once owned. I had never had a chance to talk to her before, but Frank said she was a retired property rights attorney who had worked in Washington, D.C. for more than 30 years, defending small landowners against illegal seizures by governments and large corporations. When she heard about what was happening to me, she immediately wanted to help. I was still weak, but I couldn't let this opportunity pass me by. In the hospital room, Susan began to ask me about everything that had happened. The letters from the HOA, the threatening calls, the arrival of the city inspectors, and my discovery of the plans to develop the government complex. She listened without interrupting, taking notes slowly and precisely. When I told her about the closed council meetings, how the HOA had suddenly changed the rules and tried to get rid of me, I saw her eyes light up with determination. When I asked her what she thought of all this, Susan simply said, "This is not a simple HOA dispute. This is a serious abuse of power." Then she opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file that I don't know when she had collected. It contained property records, cadastral maps, and city council meeting minutes that she had found. And that's when I knew that my suspicions weren't just guesses. I had proof. Susan dug into the city's records and found a serious error. My land had never actually been annexed into the city limits. When the area was expanded 15 years ago, there had been an administrative error in the demarcation process, and my farm remained under the jurisdiction of the county, not the city. That meant the new laws they were trying to impose on me were invalid. But that wasn't the most important discovery. Susan also found another document, an internal memo between the HOA and the city planning department, which confirmed that the HOA was created with the direct support of city officials to help speed up the process of modernizing the area. In return, key members of the HOA, including Linda, would receive special tax incentives if they helped eliminate non-conforming properties like mine. The last piece of evidence Susan found sent shivers down my spine. A recording from a closed-door city council meeting 2 months ago, where Mark Peterson said bluntly, "Miller's Farm is the key. Once we clear that land, the whole project can move forward without a hitch." He didn't talk about code violations, public health, or any of the HOA's concerns. He was only concerned with clearing the way for his plan. I felt a surge of anger rise inside me. They had never really cared about so-called community standards. They didn't care about neighborhood beauty or the safety of residents. This wasn't a fight about livestock or urban planning. It was a case of manipulating power for personal gain. Linda and Mark were trying to use the government to their advantage, and I almost let them succeed. Susan put her hand on my shoulder, her eyes determined. "We can win this, Robert, but he must prepare for a long fight." I looked at her, then at Frank and Ellen, who had been with me through the last few tense weeks. I remembered everything I had been through, the threats, the anonymous messages, the sleepless nights worrying about the future of this land. I had thought about giving up, but not anymore. I knew I was no longer alone, and more importantly, I knew I had a chance to turn things around. When the doctors released me 2 days later, I went home no longer a man backed into a corner. I had evidence. I had a lawyer who knew how the system worked. I had neighbors who were willing to stand by me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, because now I wasn't just fighting back, I was fighting back. When I returned home from the hospital, I was no longer a man who could only defend himself. I now had a powerful ally, a lawyer who knew how the system worked, and most importantly, I had evidence. But I also knew that Linda, Mark, and the people behind them would not give up easily. If I wanted to keep my land, I needed to expose the entire scheme before they could take further action. In the days that followed, Susan and I worked tirelessly. She contacted a former colleague at the land surveyor's office to verify the boundaries. When the county reported back, the truth was clear. My land had never been annexed to the city. That made all HOA regulations and city laws invalid. I was still under county jurisdiction, and any changes would have to go through the legal process, which the city had never done. This fact was only the tip of the iceberg. As Susan dug deeper, she discovered something more important. My property was protected by a special agricultural designation that my grandfather had applied for in 1970. This designation exempted small farms from new urban regulations, as long as they continued to operate as agricultural operations. More importantly, it had never been rescinded, meaning I had the legal right to raise livestock regardless of what the HOA or the city said. This explained why Linda and Mark were so determined to force me to leave. They knew that if I stayed, they couldn't legalize their plans for the government complex without going through a formal land acquisition process, which would delay their project for years. But if I were forced to sell or left under pressure from the HOA, they could quickly buy the land back at a low price and erase all traces of my exemption before anyone realized what was happening. We needed more evidence to prove that this was not just an administrative error but a deliberate plan. Susan filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain documents about the city's development project. A week later, a former city clerk who had retired a few months earlier contacted her. Hearing about the incident, she revealed that she had a bad feeling before leaving. Anticipating that documents might be deleted, she had backed up some important internal files just in case they were deleted when the project was officially approved. Inside a small USB drive she passed to Susan was a recording from a closed-door city council meeting. Mark Peterson's voice was clearly heard. "Miller's Farm is the key. Once we clear that land, the whole project can go forward without a hitch." There was no mention of code violations, no mention of residential standardization as the HOA had claimed. They just wanted me gone so their plan could go forward without opposition. The recordings were only part of what we discovered. Susan also obtained emails between Linda and the city planning department, showing that they used the HOA to pressure me to leave. One city official even wrote in an email to Linda, "If the HOA creates enough problems, he will have to sell or leave." This confirmed the collusion between the HOA and the government, proving that they intentionally abused their power to seize the land for personal gain. Sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the documents and evidence spread out, I felt anger boiling. This was no longer about goats or farmland, but about legal ownership and a system that was being exploited for profit. They wanted not only to push me out of my home, but also to hide corruption. But now I knew the truth. For the first time, I felt I could fight them. Susan looked at me, her eyes determined. She said that with the evidence in hand, we would not only take this to court, but expose it to the public, forcing the people behind it to reveal themselves. This is no longer just a small battle between me and the HOA. This is a confrontation with an abusive system where people like Linda and Mark think they can manipulate the law to serve their own interests. But this time, they have misjudged their opponents. I clenched my fists and took a deep breath. I was ready to fight. I was no longer the one being chased. Now I would fight back. I had the truth on my side, and with Susan at my side, I had the legal tools to bring them to justice. In the following days, Susan worked hard to prepare her case. With the land records, board meeting minutes, emails between the HOA and the government, and the recording of Mark's voice, we had a solid case. The recording showed that this was not a matter of community standards or zoning, but of abuse of power for personal gain. We filed a lawsuit against the HOA in county court, alleging property rights violations and abuse of power. The crux of the case was that my property was not under the jurisdiction of the city or the HOA, yet they were still trying to impose regulations. Threatening me with an invalid provision was a serious violation of property rights laws. But we didn't stop there. Susan knew that the lawsuit against the HOA was only the first step. If we wanted to truly expose the manipulation, we needed to get the city involved, because Mark Peterson and his bureaucracy were the ones who had orchestrated and protected the scheme from the start. So we filed a second lawsuit against the city, accusing them of abuse of power, violating the land acquisition process, and conspiring with a private organization, HOA, to violate the rights of citizens. Susan didn't just take the case to court, she also used the media to amplify the impact. She sent copies of the evidence to a major state newspaper, where a team of investigative reporters immediately picked up my story. When the first article was published, the headline made me read it over and over again. Lexington manipulates zoning to grab residential land. Farmer fights back. As the news spread, public opinion began to boil. I thought I was alone in this fight, but as my story came to light, I realized that I was not the only one who had been bullied by HOAs and government abuse. Other residents in the area began sharing their stories. People who were unjustly fined for having vegetable gardens in their front yards. People who were forced to repaint their houses because the HOA found the paint color out of date. People who were forced to remove things they had cherished for years. As the lawsuit gained attention, the city government floundered. Some officials denied responsibility, blaming the HOA. But internal emails between Linda and planning officials exposed the conspiracy from the start. When the local news channel aired Mark's recording, he could not deny it. Everyone could hear him discussing how to get rid of me, so the project could proceed. Even some city council members began to turn against Mark, fearing that if they continued to support him, they would be drawn into the scandal. 2 council members publicly withdrew from voting on the new regulations, claiming they knew nothing about the land grab and did not want to be involved in a serious legal case. The HOA, which had once confidently pushed me out of the neighborhood, was now in crisis. It was divided internally, with some supporting Linda while others resigned to avoid involvement. Social media groups that had once smeared me were now flooded with posts questioning the HOA for its abuse of power. Residents who had once been indifferent began to wonder, if they did this to me, who would be next? But I knew the fight was not over. The HOA and the government would not easily admit their mistakes, and I could not rely on public opinion alone. I needed a legal ruling to stop them from manipulating the law. With the evidence in hand, the land boundary violations, the ignored agricultural protection regulations, and the collusion between the HOA and the city, I believed that the court could not ignore the truth. When Susan filed for an emergency hearing, for the first time in months, I felt confident that I would win. I had endured threats, anonymous messages, isolation, even a heart attack from stress, but it had only made me stronger. Abusers of power believe that no one dares to stand up to them, but the truth, once exposed, cannot be hidden forever, and I was about to prove it. I never thought I would have to go to court to defend the land my family had held for half a century, but that morning, standing in front of the county courthouse, I knew this was the moment to make a difference. I was fighting not just for myself, but for everyone who had been oppressed by the HOA and the government. The room was packed with people from the neighborhood, newspaper reporters and television reporters. Their eyes followed me as I walked in with Susan, who carried a file full of evidence of the abuses we had uncovered. The trial opened with a defense from the city and HOA trying to paint me as an obstacle to development. They insisted that the goats did not meet modern standards and that the small farm was slowing down the community. But when Susan spoke, the tide turned. She pointed out the boundary error, proving that I had never been part of the city, rendering all the regulations invalid. She then invoked the Agricultural Protection Statute, asserting my right to raise livestock regardless of whether the HOA or the city changed the rules. The room fell silent at the sharp argument. When Susan turned on the tape recorder, Mark Peterson's voice came out about his plan to remove me. The city representative paled, and Linda looked down, avoiding eye contact. The trial climaxed when Susan released internal emails between Linda and the planning department, revealing a plan to manipulate the HOA to put pressure on me. This was not just an abuse of power, but a plot to illegally seize land. Faced with clear evidence, the jury was forced to admit serious violations by the government and the HOA. The court declared all HOA regulations imposed on me invalid because the property was not within city limits. The city had to cancel the planning of the government complex and reimburse all my legal and medical expenses. More importantly, this ruling created a precedent, preventing HOAs and governments from imposing illegal regulations on legal owners. After the trial, public opinion was in an uproar. The press continued to report, and public pressure forced Mark Peterson to resign from the city council, facing charges of conflict of interest. He quickly withdrew, avoided the media, and disappeared from Lexington politics. A few days later, Linda Peterson also resigned as HOA president when the residents she had manipulated turned their backs on her, demanding changes in the way the association was run. Under pressure from the court and public opinion, the city not only canceled the planning, but also removed all restrictions on agricultural property, protecting the rights of residents like me. Many people who had been harassed by the HOA also took advantage of the ruling to overturn unreasonable fines. That afternoon, standing on my land, watching the goats graze, I felt a sense of relief after months of fighting. This fight was not only about protecting the farm, but also setting a precedent for others. Linda and Mark lost their abusive power, but more importantly, I proved that even ordinary people can fight back against abuse. And most surprisingly, a small dispute sparked a wave of powerful change. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, the story of a small farmer standing up to a corrupt HOA and government spread far beyond Lexington. Newspapers continued to cover the case, national media commentary began to appear, and I even received an invitation from a major television network to share my story. But what mattered to me was not the media attention, but the real-world impact of this fight. One significant change was the passage of the Landowner Rights Protection Act. In response to pressure from my lawsuit, the state passed a law that limited the power of HOAs and local governments to impose illegal regulations on land with historic or agricultural value. This meant that HOAs could not use regulations to take over land, and governments had to follow due process when enacting new regulations. The incident had not only legal ramifications, but also changed the community. The HOA, which had once exerted power over residents, became the focus of criticism. After Linda resigned, a new board was elected committed to serving the real interests of residents. One of their first decisions was to repeal the unreasonable regulations Linda had imposed, ranging from bans on vegetable growing, birdhouse installations, to unreasonable fines for not complying with the HOA's aesthetic standards. People who had been silent were now speaking out, not just about my case, but about the injustices they had endured. Residents who had supported Linda found themselves exploited, led by a vision of modernization that masked greed. Neighborhood meetings, once controlled by HOAs, became forums for building a community of mutual respect. And then there was Maggie, the little goat who almost lost her life in the fight. After recovering, she became a symbol of perseverance and justice. One day, a group of elementary school students came to visit, carrying a sign that read, "Maggie's Defenders." My teacher told me that my story had inspired the class to stand up for what was right. Maggie became the unofficial school mascot, welcoming the children over every weekend, feeding them carrots and petting them like a special friend. They learned that something as small as keeping a herd of goats could change their entire community, a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Looking back, I understand that this was not just a fight to protect their land, but a testament to the power of unity. When people reject abuse of power and know their rights, no force can impose them unjustly. I still live on my land, wake up to the sound of goats, and tend the trees my father planted. But now I feel more at peace, knowing that this fight was not just to protect my home, but also the freedom of many others. Sometimes the biggest battles start not in Parliament or in the meeting room, but in a small garden, an old plot of land, or a herd of goats, and they can change everything.